And our topic today is planting in a shady garden. Next slide. And again, I'm with the Green Springs Park Master Gardeners. And just a quick info about myself. I was in the class of 2008, so been doing it for a while. Most of what I do is the enrichment class for plants in 4th grade classes called Ready, Set, Grow. My main interest is our environmental issues and what we can do in our yards to help the environment. Of course, that leads me to native plants. The last 20 years or so, 25 years, I've been interested in native plants, and I'm a member of the Virginia Native Plant Society, which is a fantastic organization. So we're going to be covering planting in shady and dry locations, and we'll have suggestions for plants that you can put in those locations. Many of the guidelines for any garden apply to shady gardens, including having soil tests done, which can be done through Virginia Tech. I believe you submit your sample to a master gardener, or you can send it directly to them. You might also think about microclimates in shady areas and the exposure. If you have a large shady area, the interior will be much darker than the around the perimeter. So you might be able to plant things on the perimeter that you could not in the middle. Also come up with a strategy for dealing with predators, particularly deer and possibly underground critters like voles. The best thing I used to spray, but for deer, I generally put up fencing nowadays. You put it up once and it stays there. You want to have patience with plants. They're going to need time to establish in dry areas. So for the first couple of years, you're going to have to water them carefully and do it. The best way to learn about gardening is to get out there and do it. Experience is probably the best teacher. You'll probably kill a lot of plants. I know I have, but I keep going, and I get disappointed when I go out and a plant disappears because the deer have eaten it, or a vole has gnawed around the base of a tree and killed the tree off. But you have to be very persistent. One thing on microclimates I wanted to mention was you can have shade from deciduous trees, which of course are trees that drop their leaves in the fall. And so in the winter, it's open. One plant or plants that could live in that environment are ephemerals like bluebells and marybells, and wonderful plants. They're blooming now, actually. And they have evolved to take advantage of that period of time when it's warm enough when they can grow, but the deciduous leaves have not come out. Of course, if you have conifers, pine trees, and you have the shade from them, they're going to be green all year long, and the shade will also be there all year long. Okay, we'll take questions at any time on the chat, and
we don't have any questions as now.
Okay.
So I think we can move on.
Okay. Great. So let's begin with Gardener Lynn, who has some suggestions for plants for shady areas. Lynn?
Hello, thank you, Patrick. I'm Gardener Lynn, and as Patrick was saying, In the spring, if you have trees that drop their leaves during the winter, there's a period in late winter, early spring, where there's no leaves on the trees yet. So you might think you have a totally shady garden, but the point in fact is that you actually have some sun. So you have a chance to have some plants in there that are spring blooming and very pretty and attract a lot of native bees and wildlife. Next slide. So I'll start out with hostas, and they're a very nice plant. Very beautiful foliage, and they come up with little white flowers and so forth. The only problem with hosta is that the deer really love them. I had some hosta out front in my yard, and the leaves got completely bitten back to the stems. So I dug it up and I moved it to the side yard. And I kind of made a little salad bar on the side yard for the deer. And the interesting thing is that they don't like grazing in the side yard for some reason. So I have a nice mix of hostas there. And they're very easy to grow. And when they get too big, you can just get a shovel in there and divide them up and move them around. Next slide. Before I talk about Pachysandra, I did want to say that if you have a wet, shady garden, you know, it's a very difficult situation to deal with. One of the first things you're going to want to think about is making some soil amendments. And I can't stress this enough. The soil is like one of the, besides water and sun and so forth, the soil is very, very important to having a successful garden. And it's not just about mulching, it's about adding soil such as leaf grow, compost, and really putting a couple inches on top there to really get some nutrients into the soil. And then you can lay your mulch on top of that. But also when you're digging holes for your new plants, you want to put some compost at the bottom of the hole. That's very important as well. If you have a lot of water, the best thing is just to amend the soil, you know, get some loamy soil in there, dig it in, you know, work the clay soil we have in Virginia, which tends to hold moisture. And the other thing I wanted to say is when you're buying plants at the nursery, look to find the plants that are in the shady locations at the nursery itself, because those are the plants, if they know their stuff at the nursery, they're going to put the shade plants in the shady areas. And that's where you want to go looking for your plants. Also, you want to make sure the little tag on the plant says partial shade to shade. If it says sun or shade, avoid it, because, you know, it's either one or the other. So look for partial shade to shade plants when you go. So that brings me to Pachysandras, and they're a very nice plant for a shady area, a large shady area. You buy them in plugs and you put them in here or there, and it eventually will fill in for you, but it will take a couple years for it to get to look like this. Next slide.
Actually, Lynn, I wanted to mention, again, I'm the native guy. There is a native Pachysandra, and I have actually put it in my front yard in a shady area, and it's glacially slow expansion, but it has expanded. So that's another option people may want to consider.
Yeah, definitely with plants like Pachysandra, you're in it for the long game. You know, you're not going to have instant fill in, even if
Right.
you buy 100 plugs and put them in, there's going to be gaps. But give it a chance and it'll fill in. Just like ferns. Ferns are the same way. You put a few of those in, and before you know it, in a few years, you have a bed full of ferns. So this is up on the screen is Jacob's Ladder, and this particular one is called Stairway to Heaven. And this is a native plant, and it has some very nice foliage. At least it did when I planted it. And then I found after, like, toward the end of the summer, when it wasn't getting very much sun at all from my beech tree, it started to lose its variegation. But it's still a nice plant, and right now it's come in and it's all variegated, and the foliage is a little purple looking too, and it's very beautiful. Next slide. Virginia bluebells are another native plant, and boy, are they beautiful. I bought one of those last year, the year before, and it was just one plant, and it comes up in early spring. Beautiful, beautiful. And I now have like 3 or 4 of them in my garden. If you're in the Northern Virginia area, I recommend going to Riverbend Park, because they're just all under the trees, and it's just a beautiful sight to see them. Next slide.
Lynn, I just want to mention on the bluebells that they after they bloom and their leaves die away and they kind of disappear for like late spring and the summer. So you have to be careful not to disturb them. You can't see them, but you know they're there. So you have to be careful not to bother them at other times of the year.
Yeah, you have to be mindful about where generally they're located, so you don't plant anything else there. So this is a laminium. Is that I hope I spelled that right. I have a couple of these, and this particular one's called Purple Dragon. And this is a wonderful shade plant because you get the variegated foliage and you get this good color in summer. And people have stopped to admire this in my front yard. The only thing I'll say about these plants is that they're easily bruised. So you have to be very careful not to rustle them around too much. These are perennial, so they'll pretty much disappear in the winter, and before you know it, they're back again in the spring. Next slide. Oh, Helleborus. This is a photo I took in my own yard. These are just great flowers for shade, and they're kind of interesting looking. They're also known as Lenten Rose, because they generally come up around the period of Lent in the Christian tradition. Generally, their little heads hang down a bit, so they're good to plant on a slope. And in the spring, you can prune back a lot of that green foliage to just let the flowers shine. Yeah, and in the summer, throughout the summer, you'll have the foliage. Yeah, I guess I better be moving on. So go ahead. That's fine. Next slide. So these are foam flower, and they're great because they attract some of those early bees, not your honeybee type, but like your sweat bees and so forth. And they have fantastic foliage, as you'll see in the next slide, and they're very reliable. You can see the beautiful foliage on that. They come in many different varieties, but look at those beautiful white flowers, so fluffy and delicate looking.
Lynn, I have some of these, and they can be very aggressive spreaders. I have them in an area, and within about 3 years, they completely covered the area.
Oh boy, so how do you manage that, Yvonne?
I have to pull them out of the azaleas that are there. And I give them away.
That's
They're
great.
easy to root. And I don't know if it's just the, it is the native variety. It's one of their, it's a cultivar of the native variety, but it has the little red in the leaves, and they are very, like I said, they're big spreaders. Right now I have some phlox stellinophora and the foam flowers, and they're kind of fighting it out in the yard out there. But they're both very aggressive. I don't know who's winning though.
Lynn, do you cut the foliage back, or does the foliage survive into the?
No, I just let
Like
the
the
foliage be. Mhm.
It
Yeah.
kind of looks, you know, kind of rough in the winter,
Yeah.
but all of a sudden it just greens up. And I don't know if, is yours aggressive?
Mine aren't aggressive yet, but good to know, because last year I put them in and I got 10 of them. So
Wow. I could have shared 10 with you, trust me.
By the way, another spreader, what are the bluebells? They'll reproduce fairly easily, I found.
Mhm.
If they're in a spot they like.
Yeah, that's why, you know, as gardeners, we're in it for the long game. So you might think, oh, you know, there's bareness around my plants, but buy some of these, give it a chance, and you'll have a nice full flower bed. Next slide. These are Heuchera. Let's see,
Euchera.
Heuchera.
Thank you. There's many varieties of these, and the ones with darker leaves will do well in sunnier locations because the darker leaves somehow absorb the sun better, but these lighter color ones will look nice in your shady areas. Next slide. Oh, okay, those are my photo references. And
We have a question.
oh, good.
How can I identify native Pachysandra varieties versus the non-native, and where can I buy them?
Okay, since I have them, I believe I go to, you know, native plant sales, which of course with COVID have diminished, but you know, unless it's a terribly informal plant sale or plant exchange, usually people selling them will have tags on them. You know, if you go to a garden center or whatever, there'll be a tag that'll tell you it's a native. In general, they seem to be a darker green color, and they're also somewhat variegated or mottled. So that's, you know, one thing. The non-native Pachysandra is more of a yellowy green, emerald green, and again the native is a darker green. I think, again, it may be just the conditions in my yard, which are quite shady, but I think the native spreads more slowly, but I could be wrong about that. But the main thing is the darker bluish green color as opposed to the emerald green color. Maybe someone else has a better idea on how to identify them.
I was just going to say that I always look for the scientific name, which is Pachysandra procumbens. And then you definitely know that you have the native. I guess sometimes it's called Allegheny Pachysandra. And we just had somebody post the Pachysandra Nova Natives plant sale. So you might want to visit that.
Mm-hmm.
And someone also asked about, did anyone use Mayapple in their shade garden?
I think that would be a really good shade garden plant also. I have it, and it's formed a nice drift of you know, May apples, but it gets part sun there. So I can't say it's totally shady.
I've always seen it in drier areas also, not necessarily wet, but not dry either.
Mhm, mhm.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it can actually, the May apples can survive in full sun also. I've seen them in full sun.
Mhm.
So,
I think I have a whole list of woody shrubs and trees that survive in shady areas, but we'll save those for another day. In fact, Simon is going to cover some of the shrubs that are good for dry locations. Simon?
Hello.
yeah, thank you, Lynn. Okay, Simon, if you want to go ahead and pick up on the dry areas, plants for shady dry areas now that we've covered the wet areas.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and thanks, Lynn. It was a great presentation. So next, Jamie. So in fact, you could go on to the next one as well. So I'm covering planting in dry and shady areas. And I think everybody should realize, and I think everybody knows, that all plants need some light and some water. Nothing grows in dark dry. So this is a continuum, and we all have continuums, as has been discussed today, of things that will grow in relative shade and relative dry. But nothing will grow. This is one of the toughest locations we have to deal with. And I think that the points that both Patrick and Lynn have made, that, you know, there is this period where there are not leaves on trees, and there are certain plants that actually will flower and bloom in those periods. And so those are things that will likely grow better in shade. They may need water. They may need water added to them to help them grow. Often these areas are under trees. The roots are close to the surface. You're dealing with tree roots, which are very difficult. You need to dig holes when you're planting between tree roots. It's a good idea, as Lynn has already said, to compost the holes where you're planting. And you probably need to give them a lot of water very early on in the process to actually get them maintained. Some plants, as you'll see later in this presentation, actually survive in dry areas, but they need water and perhaps even a bit of light to get going in the first instance. So there's a lot against these sorts of locations, but remember that there is a continuum and there is windows of opportunity for certain plants which have adjusted and adapted to these particular environments. Next. So just a couple of non-natives, because I want to particularly talk about natives here. We've talked about the Helleborus. They're a fantastic plant. They need a lot of water to get established, but they can actually cope with fairly dry conditions. And we have a lot of these in our garden. They're very showy. They come in a lot of different colors, as Lynn has already said, and they spread, which is terrific. They just get bigger and bigger if they're in the right environment and provide a fabulous bouquet of flowers. So I think this is a real winner for shady gardens, and even for the more drier shady gardens. The euphorbia, which is also commonly known as spurge, is an interesting one. It has a very unusual green flower, as you can see there. It's, I think, very, very attractive, and the leaves are incredibly attractive as well. We have it growing under an evergreen magnolia on a hillside. This hillside is covered in roots. The grass doesn't grow very well there at all. It's a really problematic area of our yard, and yet the spurge grows very well. In fact, the biggest problem is it grows too well, and having to contain spurge within limits. My wife is constantly having to contain the edges of this so that it doesn't get beyond where we want it. I personally like it. It's an unusual flower, but it's a very beautiful, unique flower, and it's got a very beautiful dark green leaf as well. Next. Next. Thanks. So most of the rest of my discussion is taken really from this book, and I strongly recommend it. It's been published by a group of plant and conservation groups that are interested in native plants, including the Virginia Native Plant Society that Patrick belongs to. It's a fabulous resource, and if you just Google native plants for Northern Virginia, I'm sure you'll be able to get to it. And the fabulous thing about it is you can download the book for free. So I'd advise you, if you are interested in native plants, to go to this, Google it, and download it. It's a fabulous resource, and most of the rest of my presentation actually comes from these plants demonstrated here. Thanks. Next. So in fact, there's a whole page on listing of the right plants to plant in the right place, and there's this page on landscaping in dry shade, which is very conveniently my topic today. Now, as I said, there is a continuum of dry and there is a continuum of shade, and you'll find that some of these things will do better if there's more light and more water, and some of them actually will do well in the whole continuum, which is kind of interesting, of very dark to quite light and very dry to quite wet. Very often you'll find that some of these plants will do better, and they will flower better, and they'll grow faster if perhaps they have a little bit more light and a little bit more water, but they are still tolerant to a fairly dry and a fairly shady environment, as long as they get established initially. And that goes back to the issues of some compost and some early watering to get them going.
Simon, may I say something?
Sure, Lynn.
The interesting thing is about plants that are good for wet or dry conditions is that when a plant that likes a wet area, like a bald cypress, will also do well in an incredibly dry area, because when it's wet, it's not getting the oxygen it needs. And when it's dry, it's not getting the oxygen either. Have you ever heard anything like that?
No, I haven't personally. I know clay soils, for example, are very dense, and that can create a problem. I know that certainly they say with tree roots, they seek oxygen, and very often when you get tree roots growing close to the surface, it's because they're seeking oxygen. As I said before, we have a lot of this evergreen magnolia with tree roots very close to the surface.
The reason I say that is that because the green and gold I saw in near a stream bed, and it was just a gorgeous carpet of the green and gold. And I also saw, let's see, yeah, I think that's the main one. But that also does well in a wet area. So I think there's a lot of leeway between wet and dry, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, absolutely. And as you'll see, there's one or two of the plants that I'm going to quickly go through where actually it grows in that entire continuum. You actually have, they do these little charts with sunny, half sun and full shade. And there's some plants that will grow in all of that. Next, thanks. So we're getting a bit biblical here with our Jacob's ladder and our Solomon seal, but Solomon seal is a lovely native, Virginia native. It looks a little bit like what Lynn was showing us with Jacob's ladder. Has these beautiful little flowers that come off it. We have some in our garden. It's very slow in terms of spreading, but extremely beautiful, and is growing under a Japanese maple tree, again, with lots of roots to contend with and a fairly dry environment. Next.
There's also, Simon, there's also the native Solomon seal, which I can't think of the specific epithet right now, but it has the flower mass just at the end of the flower stalk. And unfortunately, deer like to eat those, but they haven't hit mine in my yard yet. But anyway, at the end is a group of small little white flowers, and those will produce berries, red berries in the fall. I believe, did the Solomon seal you have on your picture, did they produce berries also? red berries maybe?
No, they don't. The one we
No
have
berries?
doesn't. No.
Okay.
I believe the one that you're talking about, Patrick, is in a botanical sense has always been called false Solomon seal, because
Right.
one of the ways to tell the two apart was the false Solomon seal has the flowers at the very end, while the true Solomon seal, they hang down below. And I think they are a different genus is the only difference. I think they're both in the same family and that kind of thing, but I think they're a different genus, but very similar.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, I think you missed, well, yeah. So this is a Clematis. It's perhaps not as showy as other Clematises. And the other thing that I think is important, a couple of things I'm going to talk about in this presentation are names that are familiar to you. And as Patrick has just said, there's cultivars or there's other varieties that perhaps will not do as well. So it's very important to get the right botanical name of the particular one that will grow in a dry and shady environment. So this is a native Virginian Clematis that grows well in a dry environment. Next.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Again, similarly with the witch hazels, I think we're all familiar with witch hazels, and Patrick belongs to Green Springs, and I suspect we're getting towards the end of the witch hazels at Green Springs, but every late winter, early spring, Green Springs in Northern Virginia puts on the most amazing display it has an amazing variety of witch hazels growing. They're very unique, they're very spectacular. This is again a particular Virginian variety. Again, and as you can see the description there, medium moisture, well-drained soils, it says full sun to part shade. So again, there is this continuum that we need to think about. And later on, we'll actually get to the very dark parts where we perhaps get onto underplantings underneath pine trees where you actually have a continuous shade. But that could come a little bit later. Next, thanks.
Simon, I just wanted to mention on the witch hazels, another garden club I belong to, Four Seasons, had a expert on witch hazels, and he mentioned that the Green Springs collection is one of the, like a world-class collection of witch hazels. So apparently I should know this, but I don't, the previous private owners of Green Spring were witch hazel enthusiasts, I believe. But anyway, they do have a world-class collection there. So, and they come in quite a wide range of varieties, colors. There's red ones, and of course I'm not sure whether they're breeding, but anyway, just some more information there.
Yeah.
Let me jump in with another witch hazel fact. There's one called Hammamellus X Intermedia, which is a winter blooming witch hazel. So you'll see these yellow blooms in February, which are just amazing because it's the first little sign that spring is coming.
I've always wondered why, where are the pollinators in January? It seems to be. Somebody, I asked that on the discussion in the other club, and he said if the weather warms up enough, some of the bees can come out of their hibernation for a short time. But anyway.
I think that's a very good point. I think the point about witch hazels and also about Helleborus is that they grow in very cold weather. They flower in very, very cold weather. We've had snow around our Helleborus and they're flowering through the snow. So it's one of the very few things, along with the witch hazels, which come a little bit later, where you're getting a little bit of color and the beginnings of spring, which is a nice feeling we all appreciate. Again, this is a type of a bleeding heart. It's not the typical bleeding heart that we see. So again, when you're referencing these things, be very careful of the particular variety that you're getting, the ones that are native. These are the ones which will do better in the dry and the shady areas. Next. So the golden redwood is interesting, and this is one that I was referring to earlier. As you can see on the chart, it does well in dry or moist soils, and it does well from full sun, as you can see, to full shade. So there is this continuum. Some plants do better in the full continuum, and some will do better with more sun and more shade, obviously. But there are things that actually cut across full sun to full shade, as Lynn was pointing out. Next. This is American alum root. I won't speak, there's quite a few slides here, so maybe if we just go, I'm really just showing you some of the things from that list. You can see there, partial shade to full shade. The next one. The partridge berry, again, partial shade to full shade. Next. The viburnum, a particular viburnum, which actually does well. Again, it's another one of these which actually extends from full sun to full shade and partial shade.
I think the key there is that it will flower better in full sun, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Most of these things, if there's a little bit more sun, will actually do a little bit better. If there's a little bit moisture, they'll do a little bit better. They'll flower better, they'll grow faster. So if you're really in full shade at a dry environment, you've got to be, as Patrick was saying at the very start, very patient.
One thing about the viburnum is that it is a shrub. So if deer are browsing on it, if you can just get it up to about 4 feet or maybe 5 feet, it'll be too high, and the plant can actually, I have one that's like 15 feet tall or something. So once they get above a certain height, the deer will no longer be able to reach up and get the leaves, which for the woodies is, you know, their way of coping with deer predation. But anyway, just want to point that out. Simon?
Yeah, a pervasive problem we all face is deer, and we've actually had similar problems with the young trees, where they've, in the rutting season, where they test their antlers on the young trees and almost ring bark them, which is a serious problem.
I think they're trying to remove the felt on their antlers.
Right.
You know.
Next.
Sorry, go ahead.
And this is a tree, and this was interesting. I didn't realize this, but I mean, we have, the red buds are all in full flower now. They're a magnificent tree. I absolutely love red buds, and apparently they are really quite tolerant. Once they've got established, they really are quite tolerant to varying levels of shade, varying levels of sun. I guess, you know, as Patrick and Lynn were saying, you know, perhaps some of the best ones you see are growing in full sun, but we have some under some pines, in fact, which this year, after about 5 years of getting established, are absolutely magnificent outside of our bedroom window. So this is a tree as opposed to a shrub or a flower, which is very, very tolerant to a very wide range of shade and moisture conditions.
I've seen one under a magnolia, a big leaf magnolia, and just the contrast between the big shiny leaves and these beautiful, I don't know why they call it red bud. It's more of a pink bud, if you.
Or purple even. we have one growing. We have a couple growing next to a dogwood, and they're both in flower at the moment. And the contrast of the white dogwood with the pink purpley flowers is gorgeous.
Yeah. By the way, there's a lot of breeding that goes on with red buds, and in fact, I live right near Merrifield Garden Center at Fair Oaks, and I was over there the other day, and they had a white red bud. Maybe it'd be called a white bud, but anyway, and it was also weeping. So I told the gentleman there, the Merrifield guy, said maybe it does morning coffee also, and it does all these amazing things, but they have white flowers, and it weeps also. So there's in the nursery trade, there's a lot of variations on this.
That's
I have time.
The other thing is the lovely thing about the red buds, I have one in my front yard, and is the little flowers that grow off the trunk. So the entire branch itself has all these little flowers. And I've seen many of the early bees out there. They're really good when other things aren't around, and the bees are using them and they're up in the flowers. So that's good. My neighbor has a variation of this. My leaves are green, but they have a red one. The leaves are sort of maroon red colors. So that's another, I guess, cultivar. Although if you talk to people about native plants, or what, you know, how far off are these cultivars from the actual native, and is that good for the pollinators? And one of the things that you should, that I've heard in lectures you should look for is you shouldn't change the color too much. That maybe some pollinators won't, you know, you might find a cultivar you like, but is it good for the pollinators? So if it changes the color from, I don't know, purple to some other color or white, that might not be good. And in this case, the leaves are red, so whoever eats the leaves may not do that either. So something to think.
I don't know how many of you are familiar with Mount Cuba that does research,
Oh, yeah.
but they usually review many of the cultivars. They will take one plant and they look at all the cultivars. They kind of produce a report that tells you which cultivars do best, which ones attracted bees, which ones didn't attract bees. And I usually look at those before choosing some sort of cultivar, just to be sure.
Good.
Also
One
keep
thing I
in
would
mind,
say-
also keep in mind that the color that the insects are seeing is not the same color that we see.
No,
They have different, you know, visual,
photoreceptors.
their cones in their eyes are different, and they see. And again, as Jamie mentioned, it's very important that they see the color they're expecting on a plant.
Yeah.
So, by the way, the petals can also have, not on red buds, but on other plants, they'll have lines through them that will help the insect land on the petal and get to the nectar in the flower. So, Simon, continue, please.
Sorry, the one last thing, this is actually my last slide besides sources. The one last thing I'd say about red buds is they're prolific breeders. They send out little seeds and they sprout. We in fact have 3 red buds, which are all children of an earlier red bud that we had. So they're very, very easy to propagate and to grow. And I think that's my last slide, Jamie.
I think it is. Yep.
That's my sources. I definitely recommend the Native Plants of Northern Virginia. Go to the website, just download it. It's a fabulous book, much more than what I've shown you here today.
I'm finding a lot more of the nurseries now are carrying native plants, which is really good to see.
While I was sitting here, I just jotted down a few additional native ephemerals that people watching today may be interested in, and these definitely can blossom in shade. One of them is trilliums, which come in various forms, either the wild type or also cultivars. Hepatica is an interesting lavender plant that's spring blooming ephemeral, and also columbines, and all of those can do well in shade, and I've seen them do well in shade. So some additional information there.
Also, let's not forget our ferns. Our ferns will do well in, largely they like wet, but they'll do well in a dry environment too. And they fill in really nicely. And there's so many different varieties of native ferns here in Virginia.
Yeah, the Christmas fern, of course, is the most well-known, I think. And ostrich fern, if you want something to spread, get an ostrich. They'll pop up quite easily all over the place. So do we have any
No questions?
Okay.
Good.
We did have some submitted questions, so if we could go to that slide. And there were two submitted questions. What can I plant under mature pine trees? And what perennials will grow under pine trees? And Simon, I think you had some great answers to that. You want to cover those?
Sure, happy to do that. Next slide. Thanks, Jamie.
Mhm.
So we have exactly this problem. We live on Lake Barcroft, and we have 3 huge pines down in the corner of our yard. And we have a thatch of almost a foot thick of pine needles directly underneath that. Now, again, it will depend how far down you've pruned the branches of your pine tree. Clearly, if you've got branches right down to the very bottom, nothing's going to grow under that. It's just going to be too dark and too dry. You can see there, we've got a couple of small trees. One is a river birch and the other is actually a Bradford pear growing underneath there to the slight right-hand side. But we have a whole series of things growing around there. It does get a bit of sun. It's largely in shade. We have highly acidic soil. When we did the turf program, we sent our soils in. I think our soil was something around 5.2 in that part of our garden. It's covered in pine needles, which themselves are incredibly acidic. And so anything that requires acidic, that grows well in a more acidic environment will do well. We've actually got a series of things there, and just to go through them, we've got a winterberry, which is a fabulous sorry, and all these photos were taken the other day, so they're all kind of in their post-winter. So none of them look fantastic, but they actually come very, very beautiful as the days warm up from here. We've got a winterberry. As you know, a winterberry needs a male and a female to actually produce the berries. The male we've got is actually called a Southern Gentleman, which I thought was kind of cute. and she produces very well on the back of his pollen. We have irises, a lot of irises growing under there, and they do very well. They're all beginning to come now because they're shaded and they're down by the lake and it's a little bit cooler. Other parts around the neighborhood, their irises are already coming. Ours are yet to come. We always tend to be a little bit later a few weeks later in the season than places further away from the water. We have hydrangeas that are growing very well. We've just planted alums, which look gorgeous, actually. This is the first time we've had them. And so I have to get back to you on how they actually survive and how well they do, but they're bulbing and they're looking good. We have various grasses. We have Montauk daisies, which are these succulent daisies. So it's not a Shasta daisy, which I think does require a lot of sun. It's the more succulent daisy. The only problem we have with the Montauk daisies is, again, it's like the hostas. The deer absolutely love them, and we're going to have to work out a fencing solution for that. We have various woodland flowers. You have these woods hyacinths growing there, and we have chrysanthemums growing there. In terms of the types of irises, I don't know. Are they bearded? They're bearded. They're the typical purple bearded irises that you get. So
somebody asked about deer-resistant plants, and somebody said native azaleas. Just to comment, there are some azaleas that the deer don't like as much as others, but most of them really enjoy azaleas. They think they're kind of like the hostas.
Yeah. One of the things where my wife is messing around with is planting other vegetables around, foodscaping a little bit around some of these things, and planting, for example, this year she's planted some garlic around our hostas, and apparently the deer do not like garlic. They don't like arugula. So some of these strong smelling things that we eat, if you can intersperse these vegetable varieties with some of these plants, it's another way of deterring deer. One of the other things, I worked on plant clinics in Annandale, and there's one of the master gardener there swears by, I've never used them myself, but swears by these motion activated sprinklers, which apparently you can buy these motion activated things from Home Depot quite cheaply. And if there's movement around, they'll shoot a spray and the deer get scared away. I mean, Patrick talked about fences. You know, I don't think anything is deer proof. Something's deer resistant is about as good as we get in this part of the world.
Yeah, people were asking about native azaleas. I would say, first of all, there's many. I've seen them on the top of mountains on balds, and so they're getting full sun. They need a little bit of sun. They're not particularly shade area loving plants. Under pines, I would think they would do well. What do you think about that, Simon?
Yeah, I think, sorry, that was one thing I meant to. What we do is we get so much, those pines lose a lot of needles in the fall. And we actually I rake those up and I actually put them underneath my azaleas, my rhododendrons and my camellias. All those evergreen plants, all like an acid soil, a very acid soil, which it's acid to start with with these clay soils, but they like the extra acid. I've never actually tried, and in fact, this has made me think a little bit more about actually trying to plant azaleas and rhododendrons and maybe even camellias under those pine trees to see how they go. I think Yvonne.
Yes. I grew up in the South where we had lots of azaleas, camellias, rhododendrons, and they grew under the pine trees as well as under other trees. They were everywhere. And you can go down into some of the southern, I grew up in South Carolina, some of the southern part of South Carolina. Heck, I think I froze.
No, you're okay.
We can hear you.
Sorry, I froze. Didn't like me talking. They did quite well. I was looking even at what was the golf tournament they just had, the Masters, and all the azaleas were in full bloom, but that was very typical of the South, and everybody mulched with pine needles. That was your favorite thing, and you just stuck those azaleas and camellias into the ground and they loved it. But
I saw pine needle mulch at Longwood Gardens too, like Christmas.
like I said, it was a favorite mulch in the South. People would come by saying, "I'm selling pine needles." Like,
anyone wants any in the fall, they can come and rake it for free in my backyard.
well, that was the whole funny thing. If you had pine trees, you had plenty.
Yes, indeed.
I think the Post just did a story about a property that these people owned in the South that was pine trees, and they might have possibly had to sell it, but they discovered they could rake up the pine needles and bag them and sell them, and they were able to hold on to their land for that reason. One thing about and Simon talked about it is mixing plants to avoid deer. I haven't tried it myself, but I've heard grasses like carex, if you mix them in with other perennials, it will discourage the deer from eating them.
I have deer around my house, a lot of them. And one set of azaleas, they're carooms. They do not eat those azaleas. They don't like them for whatever reason. The other side of the house has some called satsukis, and they are devouring those right now. I will not have any blooms because they love those satsukis. So it's hit or miss. And then they don't eat basil in the garden, but last year they ate all of my okra. They didn't eat the okra plant, the okra pods, but they ate all the leaves on the okra. I don't know. I can't figure them out.
Yeah, for the native azaleas I have planted, again, I mentioned the strategy. They've grown up tall enough so that they're too high for the deers to munch on them. So, and these are about 8 feet tall at this point. So anyway,
Feel about these rhododendron azalea hybrids? Do the deer like those, like the pale purple?
I'm not familiar with those. I haven't seen
I'm
them.
sorry.
Yeah. the pale purple, they look like azaleas, but they have bigger blooms. And I wondered what it was, and I saw it at the nursery. It said that it was an azalea rhododendron hybrid.
Interesting.
Could be.